Thank you, Dr. Grievous, for what was, as always, a very informative presentation and interview with Dr. Hoffman's census. I'm Tanya Dorff, and I'll be speaking about equity in access to clinical trials somewhat broadly, but with a leaning towards genitourinary cancers, which is my focus. These are my conflict of interest disclosures, although I don't think they'll really apply to what we're discussing today. It's clear that diversity is important when establishing the safety and toxicity profile of therapies, and especially in cancer, where we have a relatively more narrow therapeutic index. And this was recognized by Congress with the 1993 Revitalization Act, which mandated that trials funded by NIH must include women and minorities as participants. But I'll show you some other diversity components that are really needed for thorough investigation of new drugs in their clinical trials. We'll also review some of the barriers to clinical trial accrual, both structural and on the patient side. And finally, look at our own City of Hope experience and how we're working to overcome these barriers, as well as some proposed solutions from other institutions. So age wasn't included in that revitalization statement, but it's a very important thing to consider when we're looking at drug safety and efficacy, because we know organ function changes, body composition changes, for better or worse, as we age, and this definitely impacts how drugs are metabolized and the biodistribution. Gender variation is key. There were some actual approved drugs that had to be withdrawn due to safety signals that emerged after widespread use, and it turned out that the registrational trials had predominantly male accrual. Genetic variation has also been recognized as being important. For instance, the UGT1A polymorphisms, which impact irinotecan toxicity, these do tend to segregate within certain populations, and so if those weren't represented in the study, we wouldn't see the severe toxicity of irinotecan until post-marketing, again, when there's more widespread use. We'll talk about androgen receptor triplicate repeats as a specific example of prostate cancer that City of Hope is working on. And then there's this really interesting emerging component of microbiome, which seems to impact responsiveness to therapy and toxicity, and is really impacted by a lot of factors that we talk about when we're looking at diversity of populations. So let's drill down, starting with age. We know that cancer is predominantly occurring in patients older than 65, and yet there is a recognized mismatch between the median age of the cancer, the population that gets the cancer, and the population that enrolls in the clinical trials. Based on this presentation at ASCO last year, this appears to be worsening and seems to have a slight preponderance in industry-sponsored trials. So something that we need to pay attention to and actively try to recruit octogenarians, for instance, when that's relevant to the cancer type we're treating. Racial diversity has also been lacking in clinical trials broadly, and this from the ASCO educational book last year really was a call to arms, because especially these new immunotherapy drugs, these checkpoint inhibitors that have revolutionized cancer treatment in a number of different tumor types, as you can see, we're really lacking adequate representation of Black African Americans, as well as there's not really mention about Hispanic populations. So looking at my own cancer repertoire, in prostate cancer, we've had these landmark studies that have absolutely changed the way we practice over the last 5 to 10 years. And sadly, many of these studies are not reporting whether minorities were represented. So for instance, this is the Latitude study from the New England Journal. And if you look in the supplementary appendix and look at the demographic and baseline characteristics, there's nothing about the ethnic makeup of the patients. In the forest plot on the right, we get a hint that it was primarily done in Europe, but there was Asian accrual, and the rest of the world, we don't really know what that represents. So when I'm sitting in the office with a prostate cancer patient, I'm not sure whether this study data can be translated into what this patient will expect. Does that really matter? Is there a reason to believe that ethnicity or race might impact how the drug works? This is excerpted from an article from Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics, and it shows some specific examples where indeed race did impact the efficacy or toxicity of a drug. For instance, the antihypertensives populations, and then the dosing being different for Asian populations and African American populations for the two drugs listed in the bottom half. So it does matter, and it is important. As I mentioned in the introduction, the microbiome really, in some ways, is a summation of some of these variables that are encompassed in diversity, and they've been shown to be really important for response to immune checkpoint inhibitors. So this graphic on the right shows you many, many articles. The numbers in parentheses represent the number of studies for that bacterium. And the bacteria connected by a red line are those that are associated with a reduced likelihood of benefit from immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy, whereas the ones with the blue line represent those that have maybe enhanced benefit. And we know that microbiome is clearly related to socioeconomic status, diet, as well as geography. So here's a clear link between why race might impact responsiveness to immune therapy. And then there's more emerging literature that different aspects of microbiome impact response or toxicity. For instance, the oral microbiome appears to correlate with the risk of mucositis. So if we don't have diversity in our clinical trials, we're not going to see an accurate representation of efficacy or toxicity just on the basis of microbiome. Socioeconomic status also sort of encompasses a lot of different diversity of populations. And unfortunately, patients with lower socioeconomic status, lower income, are less likely to participate in clinical trials across the board, whether they are more or less educated, whether they're older or younger, whether they live close or far from the cancer center. And so this is something that also needs to be addressed. So let's look at some specific barriers to diversity in clinical trial accrual. For one thing, there can be a problem with no clinical trials being available for a patient presenting to an oncology clinic. And this study by Unger and colleagues showed that up to half of the time, there is not an appropriate clinical trial. It's hard to have every trial at every site, but there ought to be some adjustments that could be made to address this. Then, even if there is a trial for which a patient is a fit, the comorbidities that are exclusionary sometimes skew the accrual. So some comorbidities segregate within certain populations or certain age groups, and that can impact who can get into the clinical trial. Cost is a huge factor. So not only do patients have to pay travel costs if they're going to a more distant center to enroll in a clinical trial, but there are these standard of care costs that we'll talk about a bit later. And finally, fears on the side of the patient are a huge barrier to participation. If you look at the bar graph on the right, this was from a study of reasons that patients decided not to participate in clinical trials. And many of them are because they're worried about randomization, or that there's not a personal benefit, or the doctor didn't really convince them that this was the way to go. So we know patients are often motivated by altruism. They want to contribute to the future treatment of cancer patients, but they're also looking for the best treatment for themselves, and we have to make sure we're hearing what their concerns are and addressing them if we're going to successfully accrue them. So what has City of Hope found as possible solutions? One simple solution is to meet patients and care for them where they live. So City of Hope has developed an extensive community network. You can see on the map on the right some of the Inland Empire sites. And these sites serve patients with different insurance coverage, as well as different ethnicities, different socioeconomic status. So we took a look, we hypothesized that these centers might be better at accruing ethnic minorities in some cases, or better diversity. And we also thought for age that might make a difference, that maybe older patients were less willing to travel a large distance. So having a closer site to their home would be helpful. And what we found, we published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine this year, is summarized in the table. And you can see that minority accrual was, in fact, better at the community sites, 38% compared to about 24% on main campus for therapeutic trials. So this could be at least one part of a solution to bridge the gap. This group from Texas focused on how to improve the accrual of Hispanic patients to clinical trials, because that's the population that they were serving. And you can see a lot of their proposals focus on language, both in terms of the written materials and having staff members and translators available. And you can see that number 11 relates to outreach to the community, being not just the Cancer Center on the Hill, but integrating with the communities that we're trying to serve. This is another thing that City of Hope has really been doing. So through faculty recruitment and the Division of Health Equities, which is being run by Rick Kittles, we have started to see improvement in minority accrual. This is being facilitated by, for instance, recruiting a fantastic urologist for the Santa Clarita and Antelope Valley community site, who is really dedicated to community outreach. We're running prostate cancer screenings, which helps the community see that City of Hope is a trusted and responsible partner for their health. We have to follow through on this with relentless focus on patient satisfaction. And then, of course, for patient populations who don't speak English, there really needs to be that commitment to translation. So here on the main campus, we have in-person translators as well as the video, and we will translate our clinical trial informed consent paperwork. There was one study that I had to pay out of my own funds to translate to 3 separate Asian languages, but I was committed. I wanted those patients to have access to the clinical trial and not be excluded simply because we couldn't translate the consent form into a language they could understand. So these are all parts of City of Hope's solution to improving diversity in clinical trials accrual. And in fact, we're taking it a step further. I'm really excited about this collaboration with Dr. Kittles and a young investigator, a PhD, working in his lab, Dr. Burnham. We're looking at, we submitted a grant proposal that was funded by Prostate Cancer Foundation and Pfizer to study drugs in a minority-enriched population for metastatic prostate cancer in the first-line setting. So meeting that gap that I showed you earlier on with abiraterone, for instance, we're aiming to accrue 30% African American, 30% Asian, and 30% Hispanic and white patients. Is there a plausible biologic reason why we think it's important to study these agents in these populations? Well, Dr. Kittles has published some work showing that androgen receptor has different amounts of triplicate repeats in different populations, such as the West African populations compared to Asian. They stand on sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. And that has functional implications for signaling and how a drug like abiraterone might work. Also, talazoparib, the PARP inhibitor that's being added in this study, has some crosstalk with androgen receptor and could have differential effects in different populations. So we're really excited to take these efforts to the next level in terms of minority recruitment. Cost is often cited as a problem. So for instance, we had a cooperative group trial for renal cancer where the standard of care is observation. The experimental arm was getting a VEGF targeted therapy, so there were a lot of extra studies that were required, and patients had to pay those co-pays. Several patients dropped out because of that. But there are other trials where the drug is provided, and that can really help patients, older patients, uninsured patients, to get a medication that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford. So it can go either way, but we need to pay attention to it. There was a simple solution proposed by the Mass General group, the Cancer Care Equity Program, with simply a patient interested in a clinical trial getting referred to social work, the research nurse kind of coordinating, and then a Lazarus Foundation referral, which is a charity that sponsors funding for patients enrolled in clinical trials. And you can see that in the year after implementation, clinical trial accrual did improve. So this should help across the board, but also may have impacts on diversity. As I mentioned, we look at a trial as the latest and greatest. They're going to get the best care, but patients have fears, and we need to recognize them and head them off and really have an honest conversation, look our patients in the eye. We have to believe in the trial, and we have to understand what their concerns are and address them. So this is an excerpt from a cardiology publication, but it really covers the spectrum of any clinical trial. The patient wants to know, you'll still be my doctor. None of my rights are getting taken away. You'll still make decisions with me that are best for me, and you'll inform me if something new happens during the study that I should know about. Navigators are one proposed solution to spend that time and help educate and empower patients to be active participants in decision making. And on the left, you see two different publications which utilize nurse navigators and found that they improved clinical trial understanding, the likelihood of participating, as well as the diversity of accrual. In conclusion, I've shown you that there are a lot of reasons why diversity in all forms is critical for us to get new cancer therapies approved in a way that allows us to understand how to apply them to the patient in front of us. Clinical trials should be available to every cancer patient, and there are things that we can do structurally, but also as we write our specific protocols and as we support patients, such as by using navigators, to facilitate accrual. Our experience suggests that having community sites located in diverse neighborhoods can also help improve diversity. And having faculty and staff that are diverse and represent populations that we're interacting with as a medical organization, I think has really been key to the success that we've seen so far and for moving forward. Thank you so much for your attention.